A polyglot, poet, writer, and journalist, but above all, a military and political leader who became a global icon of anti-colonialism and socialism. And like any icon, behind him is a real flesh and blood story and a calculating, cold, and shrewd personality who led Vietnam's struggles against Japanese occupation, French occupation, Chinese occupation, American interference, and even against fellow Vietnamese who disagreed with his actions and his own interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. Today we are going to learn about the turbulent life of Ho Chi Minh. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and for those who have asked how they can support this channel, it's simply by leaving a comment, liking it, and sharing the video on your social networks. You are already giving us a big push here on YouTube. In addition, below you can find a Patreon where any contribution you can give us is more than welcome and necessary. Without anything else to add, let's start with this fascinating story. Before delving into the character, it's worth taking a pause in the region where Ho Chi Minh decides to pursue his career as a military and political leader. That region of Southeast Asia is one that has gone through many metamorphoses. After gaining independence from Imperial China in 939 AD, various dynasties flourished in the region of Vietnam, expanding its territory. However, this long period of relative independence would end in 1887 when the region became a colony of the French Empire, known as French Indochina, composed of what is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This colonial situation would not change until the 1950s with Ho Chi Minh as the protagonist. During this time of French Indochina, the Empire of Vietnam was created, a state serving France but with its own monarchy and Vietnamese emperor named Bao Dai. During these years in Vietnam, a revolutionary and nationalist fervor also arises among a moderately educated middle class, a demographic minority in a country where 90% of its inhabitants were peasants in rural areas under a model of extractive rent, single product, single export, uninterested in creating added value to what was produced in the country, which was fundamentally rice and rubber. It is in this context that Ho Chi Minh is born on May 19th of 1890 under the name of Nguyen Sin Cung in the village of Hoan Tru in the heart of Vietnam. This man had more than a dozen pseudonyms, so for didactic purposes we will use Ho Chi Minh to refer to him. His father, named Nguyen Sin Shak, was a Confucian scholar who through his studies achieved a position in a local magistracy from which he was eventually removed for abuses of power. Ho Chi Minh's father always had a certain anti-colonial fervor and refused to work in the French civil service, even though that would mean a rise in social status and benefits for his family. Ho Chi Minh had 3 siblings and spent his early years with his family among the rice fields and rural life while studying Confucianism with his father. Ho Chi Minh's mother dies when he is 10 years old due to complications from childbirth. It was not until he was 15 years old that Ho Chi Minh got the opportunity to study with a Confucian scholar named Bun Tuc Do, and there he was renamed Nguyen Ta Tan, which means Nguyen the Accomplished. In August 1908, at the age of 18, Ho Chi Minh starts his secondary education at the Hue High School. There he receives a formally French education. He was an excellent and dedicated student, devouring books on history, science, philosophy, and politics, and was known for debating, asking questions, and challenging. By 1911, after participating in a few student protests, he goes to southern Vietnam to teach as a normal school teacher. Then, after about 6 months, he leaves for Saigon. Saigon was a major city in southern Vietnam, from where Ho Chi Minh wanted to leave to see the world after having read so much. In Saigon, he works as a cook on a French-flagged ship in order to leave Vietnamese borders. As a cook on that ship, he gets to know Dunkirk and Marseille and starts working on other ships as a pastry chef, visiting various countries. He gets to know the giants of New York, Boston, and London, and by 1917 he returns to France with the outbreak of World War I. At the age of 27, he notices that nearly 100,000 Vietnamese were recruited to fight on the French side. And although he is never drafted, he and his colleagues had a common ideological denominator that those conscripts from Southeast Asia were fighting a war that was not their own. At that time, his old political concerns begin to bloom. Ho Chi Minh begins to frequent the meetings of the French Socialist Party, rub shoulders with Vietnamese workers who were discontented with the colonial government in their homeland, and comes across a certain number of sympathizers to the cause of Vietnam's independence with enough financial resources to start a subversive movement. While in the City of Light, Ho Chi Minh founds various movements aimed at raising the Vietnamese independent spirit, but does not achieve much result. And although Ho Chi Minh had not yet embraced Bolshevism, he closely followed the activity of Vladimir Lenin because it caught his attention a lot. Ho Chi Minh begins to write articles for underground newspapers, asking readers to take up arms against the colonial powers. And despite being a competent writer, his strength was in verbal eloquence rather than written, eloquence with which he knew how to empathize with Vietnamese immigrants, with promises of autonomy and an improvement in the quality of life. While Ho Chi Minh was forming his first political base, the First World War was ending, and the Allied leaders draft the Treaty of Versailles that reorganizes the world politically. Ho Chi Minh notes that the then President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, makes mentions about democracy and the self-determination of peoples and colonies. Ho Chi Minh continues to rub elbows in Vietnamese circles, prepares to write again, and distributes pamphlets calling for self-determination. These pamphlets cause the French police to start watching him closely, and the French authorities in his native region do not want him back in his country. Ho Chi Minh, hoping for some kind of solidarity from the French socialists, encounters their indifference because he notices that the French leftists were interested in preserving their overseas territories, and comes to the conclusion that he cannot trust the Westerners, considering them as hypocrites corrupted by their own interests. After that Western rejection, Ho Chi Minh looks to another part of the world, towards the eastern side, to a tumultuous nation whose inhabitants took up arms and founded a union of Soviet socialist republics. Ho Chi Minh, having followed the writings and trajectory of Vladimir Lenin, begins to look more favorably at the socialist path. In the summer of 1920, Lenin presents at the Second International a communist manifesto on colonial and national issues that reaches the hands of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh agrees with the anti-colonialist ideas of the manifesto and in the use of violence as a legitimate method for achieving political objectives. Finally, he fully assumes in favor of the communist revolution. It is from there that Soviet intelligence officers notice the potential of Ho Chi Minh and through emissaries invite him to Moscow to join the Comintern. So on June 13, 1923, Ho Chi Minh escapes on a train after evading surveillance heading to Berlin. From there, he moves to Petrograd, and then at the end of July 1923, he arrives in Moscow, where he begins to mingle in political groups and at workers' and peasants' conferences. On behalf of the Comintern, he also joins the Huangpu Military School, where Asian communist organizations learned the art of revolutionary war. The director of the school was the Chinese nationalist Colonel Chiang Kai-shek. From Moscow, Ho Chi Minh leaves for China in 1925, where he participates with the communists of that country in various activities in the Canton region. He also meets the Chinese lady Shen Xiumin, with whom he marries despite the objection of his party friends, and justifies the wedding by saying that he did it to better learn Chinese and to secure his stay papers. While in China, he conspires, recruits new members, and when he is short of money, which was very frequent, he betrays comrades whom he sees as rivals by handing them over to the French, thus cementing his leadership position. However, in 1927, following the new attacks by nationalist Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek on Chinese communist factions, the bloody Chinese Civil War begins. In response to this, Ho Chi Minh flees from China to Moscow and then returns to Paris, where he sees that things remain the same. So he begins a political pilgrimage seeking support for his revolution. He travels through Asia, Brussels, Geneva, Italy, Bangkok, India, and Shanghai, moving from jail to jail, from abuse to abuse, promoting strikes, riots, and uprisings. Ho Chi Minh could fluently speak, as well as read and write professionally in French, English, Russian, Cantonese, and Mandarin, as well as in his native language, Vietnamese. By 1930 in Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Vietnam and would continue from exile to call for his country's freedom in pamphlets that, while adhering to communist rhetoric, were considered simplistic and vague in language by his comrades. Critiques to which Ho responded by saying that these missives were dedicated to the humblest who did not fully understand the prosaltasonen characteristic of the doctrine of the sickle and hammer. Shortly after Ho Chi Minh was arrested in Hong Kong in a joint operation between the Hong Kong and French police, they judge him, and through maneuvers and legal tricks he avoids being deported to Indochina, and with an alias he returns to Moscow to study during the great Stalinist purges, from which he escapes being accused as a traitor because he had friends linked to the status quo. By 1938, Ho Chi Minh returns to China to continue working with the Chinese Communist Party as in charge of Asian affairs of the Comintern. There he moves between Chongqing, Guiyang, Kunming, and Gujing. Shortly after all this, World War II breaks out in the world, when in 1940 the Germans defeat France and install a French government servile to their interests. Ho Chi Minh and his lieutenants see the perfect opportunity to start the long-awaited revolution in Vietnam that frees them from colonial power. So they move on getting money, weapons, and men. But in Vietnam, the situation becomes more complex when in 1940 and 1941, part of Vietnam is occupied by Japanese troops in the framework of the geopolitics of the World War. In the midst of this chaos, Ho Chi Minh and his henchmen manage to step on their native soil. After more than 20 years away from it, he arrives armed with plans and ambitions. There, Ho Chi Minh founds the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh was the armed wing of the League for the Independence of Vietnam, an alliance that had been made between the Communist Party and nationalist groups to expel Japan and gain independence from France. Ho Chi Minh also presents the people with a political, economic, and social program that helps him gain support, and within a few years have hundreds of thousands of recruits among his armies. It is also at this time that he assumes the alias of Ho Chi Minh for life. The truth is that a few months after arriving in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, along with his officers and internal political forces, managed to gather an army of about 10,000 guerrillas who carried out attacks against the Japanese and the French regime. At that time, the Viet Minh had the collaboration of China and the United States and other allied forces that were at war with Japan and the collaborationist French government. Already proven as a political leader, Ho Chi Minh now debuted as a guerrilla leader capable of waging war. However, in the battles, Ho Chi Minh is captured by the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and is sent to a prison in China where he is helped to escape from jail and is forced to go underground. In March of 1944, a spy from the Office of Special Services, which was the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency named Charles Fenn, interviews a kind, bearded, and old gentleman who everyone today knows as Ho Chi Minh. There they reach an agreement with the American officer. Ho Chi Minh would receive weapons, equipment, advisors, and support from the United States. In exchange, Ho Chi Minh and his legions of guerrillas would fight against the forces of Imperial Japan, help rescue several American pilots, and provide intelligence information to the precursor of the Central Intelligence Agency. As a final request, Ho Chi Minh asks to meet with a legendary Chinese air commander, from whom he gets an autographed photo with his new memento, and now better armed and with the accompaniment of American operators, Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam and becomes again the leader of the Viet Minh to continue the war efforts. For its part, in 1945, Japan had finished taking total control of Vietnam, expelling the French colonial authorities. But this would last very little because months later Japan would surrender in the World War, and the Viet Minh would be in charge of finishing expelling them from Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh writes to his American operator telling him that the war is over, that he regrets that the American friends are leaving so soon, and that this meant that relations between Vietnam and the United States will be more difficult in the near future. This was a first victory of great magnitude for Ho Chi Minh. Now, the issue of Vietnam's independence was far from being resolved. The Viet Minh was a solid armed force, but all the institutions of the Vietnamese government were in shambles. With the victory of the Allies in the World War, the old French officialdom returned, which was determined to recover its old Vietnamese colonial territories. So little by little, the French are resuming their military presence in Indochina. At the same time, after the Japanese surrender, the north of Vietnam was now occupied by the Chinese nationalist forces, and the south occupied by the Western British Allied forces. In a burst of audacity, Ho Chi Minh, with his army swollen with more than 200,000 souls, proclaims the independence of Vietnam on September 2, 1945, and establishes the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, forming a provisional government amidst all this chaotic context and the skirmishes that were redefining Indochina. But not all Vietnamese were with Ho Chi Minh and his communist project. There were groups in favor of maintaining the monarchical order and even part of the colonial order. In the midst of this context, with the first aim of expelling the Chinese occupation from Vietnam, France paradoxically decides to ally with Ho Chi Minh and recognize his new republic, although the relationship remained tense, as it was a strategy of France to buy time. France tries to achieve a negotiation in which the Vietnamese would retain the internal sovereignty of their country, but the French would maintain control of military defense and foreign relations, and that Indochina would continue to be part of the French Union. Faced with this possibility, Ho Chi Minh said, "It's better to eat a little French shit than Chinese shit." However, he still found the conditions unacceptable. His old Western allies, the puppeteers of the plot, would not give Ho Chi Minh the leading role. Ho Chi Minh also takes advantage of this situation to internally purge Vietnamese nationalists and alleged Trotskyists from his ranks and consolidate himself as the only communist and Soviet leader in the region. In the face of negotiation failures, hostilities between the French and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh are growing. France increases the sending of troops to Indochina and begins direct attacks against Vietnamese communists that end up breaking this ephemeral alliance. By the end of 1946, a new and fierce war breaks out that would last 9 years between France and the Vietnamese independence fighters. A French bombing on Hanoi, a bloody episode that left 6,000 Vietnamese souls in the grave, was the clarion call for the conflict in Indochina. At first, the war favors the French, who managed to take and maintain control of the cities, but the Vietnamese independence fighters retreated in the mountains were gaining strength and sabotaging French military operations. In February of 1950, Ho Chi Minh, like a spider weaving alliances, meets with Stalin and Mao Zedong. Whispers of support flowed like snake venom, strengthening his path to Vietnamese independence. The Communist Chinese and Soviets supplied weapons and troops, while the Americans did the same to support the French. But their help would be of little use, as the colonial forces were increasingly diminished until they were defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh, victorious, is proclaimed as the President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. France sits at a negotiation table with Ho Chi Minh that concludes with the Geneva Agreements. These agreements sentence the absolute independence of Laos and Cambodia and the partition of Vietnam into two independent states. On one hand, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, based in Hanoi with Ho Chi Minh as president, and on the other, the so-called State of Vietnam, with its capital in Saigon, and with the former Emperor Bao Dai and Prime Minister Nguyen Dinh Diem as head of state. It was also agreed that the following year in 1956, a referendum would be held in both Vietnams to decide by popular vote whether they would remain separated definitively or if they would reunify into a single country. Whatever came for Vietnam, independence seemed to be a fait accompli. The Geneva Agreements were followed by a period of 300 days in which almost 1 million Vietnamese, mostly Catholics, migrated to the south, and another group of Vietnamese, mostly Buddhists and communists, settled in the north. Simultaneously, Ho Chi Minh attempts to govern internally and implement reforms for the people. Between 1953 and 1956, several collectivizations and agrarian reforms were carried out in North Vietnam that, similar to the Soviet Union, ended the lives of more than 10,000 Vietnamese landowners or political dissidents. Meanwhile, the referendum that sought to resolve the partition between the two Vietnams was about to be held. But in South Vietnam, they knew that the referendum would favor Ho Chi Minh as the new leader of a reunified Vietnam, so the Prime Minister of South Vietnam, supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, denounces his rejection of what he considers fraudulent elections, announces that they will not take place, and begins to make military preparations. Ho Chi Minh's supporters denounce this as a coup d'etat, which ends up being the trigger for a new bloody period for these Asian lands. The so-called Vietnam War, or America's War, as the Vietnamese call it. North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other Western nations. This war lasted a long 20 years, with over 1 million deaths, and in it Ho Chi Minh ends up being consecrated as a great military strategist. At the start of the war, orchestrated by Ho Chi Minh, the so-called National Liberation Front of Vietnam emerges in South Vietnam, also known as the Viet Cong by its adversaries, a force of guerrillas organized and supported by North Vietnam. The Viet Cong begins to execute in the south the maneuvers outlined by Ho Chi Minh and recover important territories, while in North Vietnam the communists were carrying out an intense ideological and ethnic purge. During the agrarian reform of North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh manages to create a network of routes and paths that snake through Laos and Cambodia, and that with logistical cunning allowed the flow of men and weapons from North Vietnam to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. But with Ho Chi Minh's health unraveling like an aged tapestry, he decides to draft his will as a final challenge to fate. Le Duan emerges, an heir anointed in the shadows, woven with the threads of the party's power. Ho Chi Minh would remain president of Vietnam, but now his role would be that of a haggard advisor on the political stage, passing the baton of state power into the hands of a very well-trained and very cold elite, an elite that unleashes a brutal and fierce guerrilla war in Vietnam. Homicides, public attacks, and infrastructure sabotage triggered a whirlwind of chaos in South Vietnam that refused to surrender. The dragon of communism raised its claws, and the United States upped the ante by sending its sons to the bloodied board in 1965. John Kennedy and later Lyndon Johnson led young American soldiers into a terrain that devoured strategic hopes. With the United States also came tons of bombs that fell from the skies over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, allowing South Vietnam to gain some ground, but also earning the total repudiation of the population. After this, the Viet Cong furiously attacks the American strongholds with guerrilla warfare and begins to make them see that they were in a terrain that was overwhelming them. As 1969 loomed and the claws of the Viet Cong dug into a crumbling South, Ho Chi Minh, caught in a tug-of-war with death, suffers a heart attack. His heartbeat faded, and on a fateful September 2nd, 1969, the last breath of Ho Chi Minh faded away, leaving behind a tumultuous world. He would not live to see the humiliating withdrawal of the United States in 1973 from Vietnam, nor would he live to see the definitive victory of North Vietnam and the Communists in 1975 after invading South Vietnam. At the age of 79, Ho Chi Minh leaves this earth, but his figure transcends time as a banner for all kinds of factions and interests. The victory he longed for as an impossible dream, after decades of war under the communist and anti-colonialist flag, flourished in the hands of his heirs. On April 30th, 1975, the Viet Cong banner sank into Saigon and marked the dawn of a tumultuous transition. Vietnam, divided and tortured, stitched up its wounds and was reborn as a socialist republic. However, turbulent times would come again for Vietnam, entering a war against Cambodia and adapting to a changing world that was discarding old communist doctrines.